So thank you and good morning, and I welcome you on the behalf of PERICLES. My name is Christian Muller. I'm working at B.USOC, the Belgian User Support and Operations Center, and I'm working on the space case of PERICLES. I'm still a food at the Royal Belgian Institute for Space Aeronomy, and in this way, I came involved in this subject of change something like 30 years ago, when there were the first publications about the Antarctic ozone hole. I found data on stratospheric ozone, stratospheric Antarctic ozone, in shoeboxes in the Royal Meteorological, Dutch Meteorological Institute in De Bilt. And happily, in these shoeboxes, there were rolls, there were notebooks, and the original observers had not destroyed their rejected data. So I could prove that these original observers did not reject low data. So the Antarctic ozone hole is a now permanent feature of the atmosphere since 1984, and it did not exist as it is before. By the way, 2016 is quite a big Antarctic hole. So if somebody says to you in the press that the Antarctic ozone hole has recovered, just wait for the data. But anyway, this is the way, by simply digitizing paper rolls and notebooks, I became an expert on data. So when I entered in B.USOC, I was not only the science coordinator, but the data manager. In fact, a science experiment in space is just data coming from a sensor in space and going to a scientist which produces scientific products. But in the meanwhile, there's an enormous amount of data which the scientist does not use. And this data might contain scientific information which will be important for scientists of the future. And that's the way PERICLES helped us in trying to solve this problem of helping scientists of the 22nd century, for which we do not know their needs. So change was really a circumstance of my life, because I worked on atmospheric components which could not be measured in 1967 and which are now major greenhouse gases. And we can even say that we change geological era from the Holocene to the Anthropocene. Of course, to have this proved, you need approval by the Stratigraphic Association. But as I was before, I'm not yet a fossil. But the fossil exists. It is the layer of radioactive deposits which had a peak in 1962 and which is universal. Our PERICLES program has also an overuse case than science. It is art and media managed by Tate. And the change in art and media is not only the technological change in digital art. It is really an element of societal change of all kinds of elements. It's almost like, it's very similar to the recording of performing arts and their reconstitution as art works of a similar value. But for this, I just want you to go to Pip Lorenson and the Tate team to have more details. Yesterday, we had a very interesting session. First, the presentation of a preserveware portal, which will be the legacy of PERICLES. Second, a debate on the evolution and future of OAIS. And there was also a big element of change. All the people of the panel were ladies. And I remember having been observer at a mountain observatory where women were not allowed to stay at night. So it is an important societal change. The afternoon show the different aspects of PERICLES, including the quite successful demonstration of PERICLES. And it ended up in the DCP Awards, which are certainly, which have shown me the diversity of what we do and the quality of what is done in data preservation, at least in the English-speaking world. And finally, today, we have a day which is more concentrated on the new aspects of change. And the keynote will be introduced by Dr. Addis, who after studying and working on long-term data retention at the University of Southampton, founded as a spin-off the Arkivum company. And he is going to explain you the diversity of what he does right now. So thank you.
Good morning. Firstly, I'd like to say I thought yesterday was absolutely fantastic. Really enjoyed it. DPC Awards last night, absolutely brilliant. So I'd like to take this opportunity to express my thanks to everyone in this room for making that happen. Brilliant event, and I'm really looking forward to today as well. Secondly, that URL is actually a short DOI. There is an online version of this presentation with speakers' notes and URLs and everything else that you might ever need. So, Pip very kindly asked me to give this talk, and she said, look, you've been working in digital preservation for a long time. You've been at a university, you've been involved in a whole series of European projects, you've done technology transfer, you've spun out a business. Arkivum now provides solutions for digital preservation and archiving in a range of markets. So Pip said, you've seen change, you've seen the need for change, come along and talk about that. And I thought, brilliant, no problem, I can do that. And I sat down and I thought what I'd actually end up saying. And I had a bit of a problem because the message that kept coming through was preservation, it's bloody hard work. All right, and I don't mean the European projects, I mean it's bloody hard work sustaining the results of European projects on digital preservation. It's bloody hard work getting someone to invest in a company that provides digital preservation. It's bloody hard work selling digital preservation outside of the traditional sort of hunting ground of museum, libraries, and archives. And I thought, well, I can hardly stand up and do a keynote which says preservation's bloody hard work. So I thought, well, I'll sort of follow Kara's example and I'll try and look outside of the box and look at the need for change and where actually digital preservation can be applied to solve new problems in new communities with a much wider benefit, and how that might then feed through to benefit us within our digital preservation community. And that's what this talk is about, and it's called Preservation Through the Power of Many. And hopefully you'll see why I've called it that as we go along. I'll start by talking about the NHS. Right, so the NHS provides free healthcare to 65 million people in the UK. It's got 140 billion annual budget, 1.7 million employees, and it happens to be the 5th largest employer in the world. The only people bigger are the US Department of Defense, the Chinese military, Walmart, and McDonald's. And I suspect McDonald's has helped the NHS get up the rankings somewhat. But the NHS is also in crisis, right? You can't turn on the television without seeing a news story about staff shortages, budget problems, longer waiting lists, people on strike. And that's because the NHS is really struggling with a fundamental problem of a growing and aging population who have increasingly complex healthcare problems. Cancer, heart disease, dementia, Alzheimer's, okay? And the NHS is really struggling to cope. Now, if you're looking inside the box at the NHS, you might say a solution is, well, employ more staff, or increase the budgets, or improve efficiency, or develop new healthcare treatments, new technologies. And of course, those are all valid things to do and all important things to do. But if you look outside the box, well, actually, a better way to tackle the problem is to look upstream and the population as a whole looking after itself better, so then the NHS has got less burden coming downstream towards it. And to give you an example of that, there are 350,000 new cases of cancer each year. A third of those are a result of poor lifestyle. There are 160,000 deaths from heart disease each year, and almost all premature deaths from heart disease are preventable. So there is a lot that can be done upstream of the NHS to help solve the crisis that they're in, if only people took better care of their health. And the argument I'm going to make is that exactly the same is true in our community. If only people took better care of the content that they created, then as a digital preservation community downstream, we would have an easier job of the long-term preservation and access to that content. And this sort of comes back to some of the things that Cara mentioned yesterday. Preservation, it's about maintenance, and that's what the NHS does. It's healthcare maintenance. And if you take better care of your health and maintain yourself, then the NHS has fewer problems, and the same is true in the content creation community. To put that into numbers, 65 million people in the UK, there are 680,000 trained professionals in healthcare. Those same 65 million people generate data personally and professionally. And I reckon there is approximately 10,000 people in the UK who are professionally trained in some way for digital preservation and archiving, which means that we as a profession are outnumbered 6,500 to 1 by all the people creating content. Which means there must be an opportunity for even small changes upstream in the community that's creating that content to hugely impact the way that we have to deal with that content downstream in the preservation community. And if we don't deal with that problem, then of course it's the usual story of a tsunami of ever-growing, ever more complex data sets and real challenges, and certainly in our memory institutions. So I'm going to argue that we need to move preservation upstream into the world of content creators to take advantage of this power of many, the multiplier that's there because there's far more people involved. But to do that successfully, I think we need to achieve three things. Firstly, the application of digital preservation in the world of content creation needs to be done in a way that provides immediate benefit. It needs to solve a problem, a pain that exists right now. So in the conventional preservation community, you do digital preservation because in the long term, it allows you to get value out of assets. So you do something now for a longer term benefit. I'm saying in the content creation space, then it needs to provide an immediate benefit. Likewise, for costs, it needs to provide a way of reducing costs right now. So in the digital preservation community, we talk about things like the cost of inaction, which is basically an argument of saying you spend some money now and you spend less money downstream because you've stopped bad things happening. That argument doesn't work in the world of content creation. You actually need to save costs right now. So this goes back to some of the things that were discussed yesterday about the idea of costs and benefits and value and the incentivization of people to do stuff. And I'm saying if we want to get digital preservation into the world of content creators, then we need to look at what incentivizes them, and that's providing them with something of immediate benefit and cost saving. And to do it at scale, so we harness the power of many, then it needs to be fully integrated and automated, which in a sense means that we need to make digital preservation disappear so people are using it, but they might not even know that. And I think we can do this, right? So this isn't just a sort of figment of my imagination. This is something that Arkivum is doing at the moment, and there are all sorts of opportunities we see for taking this approach. And if we can see these opportunities, then more broadly as a community, there must be a lot more similar opportunities out there. So what I wanted to do now is spend a few minutes providing some examples, and they are deliberately outside of the sort of heritage, collecting institutions, higher education sort of space where digital preservation is sort of an accepted practice, and actually look at things like healthcare, pharmaceuticals, financial services, data protection, and how digital preservation can be applied in those domains at the point of content creation. So, first example, general data protection regulation. So in the UK, this is a European directive, comes into force May 2018, and will be implemented in the UK. Brexit will make no difference to that. And it essentially follows on from the Data Protection Act. And it's all about making sure personal data is properly protected and secured. And we all have an interest in this being done properly. And so do businesses have an interest in doing this properly, because not only is it a legal requirement, or will be, there are substantial fines if you don't comply. And these fines can be up to 4% of global turnover for an organisation. So if someone doesn't do this stuff, they can be hit really, really hard. So there is a pressing need for them to take action, and to take action now so they're compliant when these regulations come into place. And that's why there's going to be an army of people who are going to be data protection officers, and that army of data protection officers will be supported by all the people who need to implement data protection. So there is already a sort of a power of many. There's a big set of people out there who are going to be worried about this problem and worried about it now. And whilst a lot of the things they'll be worried about, things like stopping data breaches, the new regulations have some interesting things in there about individuals' rights to access their data, which includes data portability. Right? So it includes the ability for you to ask for your data in a form that is machine readable, human readable, in open standards, and is easily transferable. Right? And that's going to be a problem for industry when trying to meet those requirements. But it's not a problem for the digital preservation community. We've been doing this stuff for ages, right? We know how to do things like file format identification, file format conversion, making sure formats are open and conform to specifications. We know how to make metadata portable, right? So we know how to do this stuff. We have the know-how and the technologies that could be applied to solve this immediate and pressing problem in data protection. So I think there's a huge opportunity there if we can engage with the suppliers in that space to move the technology that we've got within our community into their community to solve those problems. And of course that has then a downstream benefit for those people who then are responsible in the long term for the retention and access to that data. Because then they'll be receiving stuff. For example, an archivist in government or a large institution will be receiving stuff that is already in open formats and open specifications and locked down. So their life is going to be easier as well. So it's kind of a potentially a win-win scenario. And I think there's lots of these cases out there if we look for them, and there's lots of opportunity if we engage outside of the sort of traditional digital preservation community. The second example I wanted to give is digital pathology and genomic sequencing. So these are transformative technologies that are starting to be applied in clinical healthcare. It means that if you go in with a disease into a hospital, then you can be diagnosed faster, the treatment can be more targeted, and because it's digital, a wider range of specialists can be involved, for example, across a range of NHS organisations. So it's set to make a real difference to healthcare, and it will impact a lot of people. The problem at the moment is that these technologies are generating vast amounts of data. So the cost of sequencing a human genome has fallen by a factor of 10,000 in the last 10 years alone. It's possible to have your whole genome sequenced in less than 24 hours for about $1,000, which means it's now affordable to do at a population sort of scale. And a single human genome is about 100 gigabytes of data. So there's a lot of it. And you can see that in things like the 100,000 Genome Project in the UK. That's already a good way through sequencing 100,000 people, and it's generating a data set that's going to stack up to be 20 petabytes. And at the moment, it's primarily going to be used for research. But this same technology is making its way into the NHS for clinical use. And that's going to cause the NHS a real problem. I mean, the NHS already spends $3 billion a year on IT infrastructure. There's no way that they can cope with the volumes of data that's going to be generated by these disruptive technologies. And neither do they have a way of really sharing that data across NHS organisations that allows the sort of full benefit of these new technologies to be exploited. So the NHS already has and will increasingly face an immediate problem of large-scale data storage and data sort of exchange or sharing between institutions. Guess what? Right, the digital preservation community knows how to do that sort of thing. Right, we've been building large-scale preservation storage for years. We know how to build low-cost storage solutions which drive down the risk of loss but still make content accessible. We know how to build archive systems, and we've got ways of building trusted digital repositories which provide secure and managed access to data across institutions. Look at things like the UK Data Service. So we have the solution, or part of the solution, to the problem that the NHS is going to face if we can move it upstream into the world where all this type of data is being created. And it will benefit them, and it will save costs, and it will need to be done in a way that's automated. And if we can achieve that, then again the benefits flow downstream. So those people, records managers in the NHS responsible for patient records, will then be receiving stuff that they know is already in secure managed storage, and that's going to help their job enormously. You know, that hurdle you have to get over of getting hold of the stuff and bringing it into your custody in the first place has already been overcome. So it's a huge benefit to what they then need to do. The third example I wanted to give is kind of related. This is about drug discovery, drug development. So this is what pharmaceutical organisations do. And taking a new prescription drug to market takes about 10 years and costs about $2.5 billion. So it's a hugely expensive activity. And the drug development process involves drug trials, right? So you test candidate drugs on real people to determine their efficacy, does the drug work, and to determine the drug's safety, as in are there any nasty side effects or do they kill people? And that, of course, is hugely important, and it's heavily regulated. And if a pharmaceutical company doesn't collect the records that are required to provide evidence of doing that properly, then they may not get their drug approved, or later on down the road, the drug might be withdrawn from market. So, and that's got huge financial consequences for them. Now, drug trial records, there are already emerging standards for structuring them in electronic format. So these are called electronic trial master files. And it might be 100,000 PDF documents and an XML backbone that describes a 3-year drug trial. So they're pretty complex and big and hairy things. But at least there's a standard there for how they should be structured. And that's part of meeting a whole load of regulatory requirements around drug development. And the need to retain these records with long-term integrity and authenticity and readily accessibility for inspectors and so on, and responsible under archivists. And this is actually traditional digital preservation space, and there is a course opportunity for the stuff that we developed in our community to apply to this problem. But there's something more immediate and pressing that needs to be addressed when this stuff is being created in the first place, these drug trial records. And that's how all this information is collected and flows between organisations. So people go into hospitals and they are part of a trial, and a drug will be administered to them, and the sort of inspector will record the results, and that will be fed up to a contract research organisation who aggregates this sort of information and delivers it to a sponsor, the pharmaceutical company, who will eventually make a regulatory submission. So there's a lot of information flying around between these organisations, and there aren't really standards for doing this yet. And the pharmaceutical and CRO community are actually trying to figure this out, trying to work it out, how they're going to do it. And if they get it right, then the savings are quite substantial, right? Because every day that a drug is delayed getting to market is 1 million loss of revenue for the pharmaceutical company. So there's a big incentive for doing this sort of stuff. And we know how to do that, right? So the digital preservation community knows how to exchange metadata between organizations, right? We've got a standard METS that does exactly that. We know how to describe events around creating content and moving content and doing things with content. It's called premise. We know how to collect files and metadata and checksums and bag them all up and exchange them between organizations with a chain of custody. That's things like Bagit. So we already have a lot of the techniques that the pharmaceutical industry are going to need to use. So we just need to sort of engage with that community, and then they can apply it to this immediate problem that they have, and that will have an immediate benefit to them and save them money and get drugs to market faster. And again, there's a downstream benefit to those people who will be ultimately responsible for the long-term preservation and access to this stuff. So the records managers in a pharmaceutical organization. Because you imagine a records manager and you've got stuff coming into your archive and it's already in sort of premise METS format and it's got checksums. That would be fantastic. So it's sort of, again, this sort of win-win scenario that I'm trying to push. And then the final example I wanted to give is financial markets. So a lot of people, I think of financial markets as sort of people on a trading floor with blazers shouting at each other, sort of buy, buy, sell, sell, or people with phones jammed on both ears, right, doing frantically trading. But actually, the financial markets have got a lot of people sat at desks on computers making trades day in, day out on behalf of their clients, sort of managing funds, executing transactions for them. And the London Stock Exchange, there are 1 million of these trades a day. Right, that's 5 billion turnover, so it's big, big business. And because it's big, big business, and people are tempted to try and sort of do insider trading or abuse the markets and things like that, there are strong regulations in place. And there's the Markets in Financial Instruments Directive that strictly controls the way all this trading is done. And there's a new version coming out soon called MiFID II. And this is going to change the game for financial institutions, because what MiFID II says is that everything that could possibly lead to a trade has to be recorded and retained for up to 7 years. And everything that could lead to a trade is quite wide-ranging. These sort of interactions take place over social media, over instant messaging, over Bloomberg, telephone recordings, emails, Skype for Business. There's a whole range of different sort of media that's involved in these sort of transactions, and this needs to be recorded. In particular, things like voice call recordings and video calls, right? So this is sort of multimedia content that now needs to be retained by these organizations for long periods of time for compliance. And these organizations haven't had to face that problem before, and they don't necessarily know how to do it, and they need to do it well, otherwise they get slapped by big fines. The challenge they face is that all this stuff is in different silos and different proprietary systems and proprietary formats. They need to get it out and get it into a sort of a unified place where they can keep it safe and demonstrate compliance. And that's a real problem for them. And you can kind of see this coming, right? We know how to do that as a digital preservation community, particularly audiovisual archiving, and I've been involved in this for years. Right? So we know as a community about codecs and wrappers and metadata for audiovisual content. We know how to do normalization into open formats. We know the value of things like pivot formats. So this is about having a small number of canonical formats to reduce the complexity down from loads of proprietary formats into just down to 1 or 2 core formats that are much more manageable. And the audiovisual community developed factory sort of approaches. The Presto Space Project pioneered this about reducing the costs of doing this, automating these sort of processes. So we've got a lot of the experience and knowledge that could be applied to financial institutions to solve their immediate problem of compliance. So they could then know from day one that they are being compliant, and they could do it in a way that would actually save them a lot of cost compared with how they're potentially doing it at the moment. So again, it's about transfer of digital preservation from our community upstream into the world of content creators. And of course, there's a huge number of people involved in doing this, so we can harness the sort of the power of many. And the benefits flow downstream to the preservation community, right? Because imagine you're in a large financial institution and you're responsible then for the long-term retention of this stuff. Imagine how much easier your life would be if it was already in a small number of open formats, and you didn't have to worry about all that sort of format identification and normalization when it landed on your doorstep, because it had already been done up front. So overall, this is kind of the point that I've been trying to make, that there is opportunity for us as a community to try and move all the fantastic stuff that we've been doing and all the great progress we've made in digital preservation over the last several decades, and move it upstream and target a new but related set of problems in the world of content creation, and get a lot more people benefiting from all the work that we've done. And if those people benefit, then we'll see investment from those much bigger communities. And that will have huge knock-on benefits to us, I believe, not just in terms of the content coming downstream being much more manageable, sort of easier to maintain and in a more healthy state, but to have a larger number of people interested in the techniques that we've developed and helping us further develop them. But I think we can only achieve that if we really address what incentivizes the content creation community to adopt the solutions that we've got. So we need to solve immediate problems that they have and help them save money, and do it in a way that helps digital preservation disappear into their day-to-day working. And that's what I really mean by the sort of the power of many. So just as a concluding slide, this is just an excuse for me to sort of give you one of my favorite proverbs. It's actually an African proverb, and it says, if you want to go fast, then go alone. But if you want to go far, then go together, right? So I think digital preservation community looking inside the box has gone a really long way and has done some great stuff with some brilliant innovation. But if we want to go far and sustain that, I think we need to look at how we can broaden out and apply some of the work that we've done to the world of content creators and solve some of their problems too. Thank you. I guess I'm open to questions. Neil.
Yeah, that was a brilliant keynote. I really enjoyed it. But it was also, for me, somewhat depressing because I remember why I joined the Arts and Humanities Data Service, which was 20 years ago. And it was because it had a really innovative collections policy, which was focused on changing the behavior of data creators.
Yeah.
It's a whole thing about producing guidance for data creators. It was a big focus of things like the original Digital Preservation Handbook to try and get people to actually move upstream, think outside the box, to do the pre-archive work. But over 20 years, I think we haven't really done as much as we could have done. And it's fantastic to hear the message being repeated again. I see the opportunities for Arkivum and probably for some other companies, but given the experience of the last 20 years, would you like to reflect on what we need to do different to really make it happen? Yeah,
I think that's a valid point. It's not the first time that this has been tried, and it's not easy. And there's a lot of talk about moving preservation upstream and preservation at the point of content creation. I think it is a case of looking at what really incentivizes those people who create content, and not just trying to move digital preservation from one domain to another domain and solving the same type of problems. I think it's important to look at the different problems that those content creators face. And in terms of how to do it, I think that's a case of partnership. So I don't think it's just an opportunity for Arkivum and vendors, although clearly we're going down that road. I think there is an opportunity for everyone to engage more outside of their community with those people in these other sectors, right? So spending time at events maybe in healthcare and sort of having that interaction between people who have, understand the technologies or the techniques and those people who have that problem, and getting that dialogue going, and then seeing if there is a relationship that can be formed that benefits both sides. And it's not going to be easy, but I think it is actually possible. I think it's a case of spending more time and focusing on that area, that there is potential to get rewards.
Yeah, I think I would accept that. Plus the need perhaps also that those communities are going to call the problem something different from digital preservation.
Absolutely.
It's quite hard to make the leap in terms of the communication and those connections perhaps. Yes,
and that's something that we discussed yesterday, is about that terminology or communication sort of difference and needing for, yesterday we talked about between archivists and IT, but I think there's also between digital preservation and a wider set of business communities that need to understand each other's terminology.
Matthew, thank you again for a great and inspiring presentation.
Thank you, Paul.
The PERICLES project, as I think everybody must be aware, is really looking at experimental data, scientific data, which is, I think, of a different class of the types of data that you've been talking about, such as media. What are your views on the curation of this sort of data, given the fact that some of this remains an open research issue?
Yeah, so I steered away from the whole area of things like research data management and open access to research data and all the incentives involved in that, and things like the FAIR principles for findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable data, which is actually quite closely aligned with some of the things that you try and achieve through digital preservation. And there's all sorts of stuff going on. There's a sort of grassroots movement of researchers wanting to share their data because it's beneficial to their community. There are carrots from funding bodies that are driving people to change their behaviour. So that's actually quite a complex space. And I wanted to sort of avoid that actually in this talk, because I could have spent, the entire 20 minutes just talking about that sort of subject and the carrots and sticks and incentives and benefits and reward systems and the complex nature of how research data management relates to digital preservation. But you're right, it is a really interesting area. I'm getting flagged as time up, I'm afraid.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask a couple of things. The first one was, it was a great presentation, but it seemed quite technology heavy. What kind of techniques could we kind of be selling to the people that we're trying to, the content creators on there? And how do we avoid us being shoved out the way by the IT department?
So it despite my best efforts, it was technology heavy because I am a CTO, right? I cannot get myself out away from technology. So kind of apologies for that, I guess. It's an interesting question. I mean, IT getting in the way, I think you have to work with IT. Presenting or engaging with content creators, I think it's a case of understanding what drives them and how they think. And trying to relate to it's sort of, you need to think from their perspective looking at you rather than what you have and try and push it to them. It's one of those community crossing gap type things of sort of trying to look on the other side of the fence on what their perceptions are and what they need to achieve. I don't know if that answers the question or not, to be honest. But I'll catch you at the coffee break.
I think we shouldn't imagine that the spaces you were describing are empty and awaiting our arrival. I think it's important to understand that.
Yep.
There are huge incumbent companies who operate in all the spaces you described. I think you're exactly right about moving our techniques and tools and things upstream. But the idea that that space is empty we need to make it really clear that that's not true.
Then that's my fault for not presenting it the right way. I wasn't trying to imply that it was an empty space. It is hugely populated with big, hairy incumbent suppliers. You're absolutely right.
And that's the bit that scares me.
But that's also why I said the route to doing it is through partnership, and it's talking to those big suppliers, and they've got a hole in their solutions, and if we can help them fill that hole to provide a more complete solution, then they've got something to take to market which is more valuable to their customers, and then you have an ecosystem, right, that works.
Okay, then we agree, but it's
Cool.
I don't want the audience to get the impression that there was any empty space there in terms of incumbents.
Absolutely.
Information governance, you know, I get invitations to conferences on information governance, and the people that turn up there, you know, they drive Mercedes. I don't do that. I'm a civil servant, and this is the ordinary bods in the companies drive Mercedes. We're talking serious amounts of money in these spaces.
Absolutely, right, and then that's a potential opportunity. Surely, if some of that money can flow downstream to us, then brilliant. Cool. Thank you.
Right, I better make an exit.